Mr. Mike Hamp take over and fill us in with all kind of good information.
Okay, thank you, Mayor Henderson. This evening, I think we want to focus on some of the larger forces and considerations that have influenced not just the construction of the budget, but the economic environment in which the council considers it, and ultimately it will be implemented. More specifically, Mr. McCormick is going to step us through a review of our current debt load and highlight some upcoming projects that are either pending, meaning that we've talked about them and they have some status. They may not be funded, but they've at least been identified or discussed. And then perhaps some projects that the staff view as important to keep in our mind as we consider budgets, that they may not be formally adopted or programmed at this point, but certainly we wouldn't want anybody to be surprised by their existence. So we'll spend a little bit of time on that. Mr. Shaw will then give us an overview of federal funding, and more specifically in that regard, the uses and anticipated impacts of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act of fiscal year 21, probably more commonly known as the CARES money. And then Mr. Shaw will also share some insight, limited as it may be, into what we know regarding the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 and what we're expecting there, or what we're hearing at this point. And then finally, I'll share some additional perspective on the city manager's recommended budget. All of this with the intention of preparing council for our public hearings on April 26th, and ultimately with the intention of helping council coalesce around a budget that the body can adopt along with an underlying tax rate. So with that, I'll hand it to Mr. McCormick for debt and project review.
Thank you, Mr. Hamp, and good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of council. So as Mr. Hamp alluded to, I'm going to work through kind of our current outstanding debt position, and then some items in both the general and enterprise funds that weren't addressed during the fiscal year 2022 budget and may require some consideration during future budgets. So first item being this is a picture of your total debt outstanding. City has about $37 million in outstanding debt and requires approximately $3.5 million in annual debt service. Like many small cities, the majority of the debt service, it's about a little over 80%, is to service school fund projects. I think that the debt service, the $3.5 million here, is around 80% city to schools, and then the total debt load is a little bit higher towards the schools. So the next debt that you have that will fully amortize will be the Waynesboro High School debt. That's from 2001. One of the items that we proposed in the city manager's budget is to go ahead and pay the last payment of that debt, which will come during 2022. So that would be, as you see a change. So this is a copy of your debt amortization schedule, and as you can see, you get some reprieve during 2023. So one of the items that we suggested was to go ahead and pay off the 2021 debt, or the 2001 Waynesboro High School debt. And what that does is reduces the strain of the debt on the general fund during the current year, and it also allows the city to use those resources elsewhere. It's also in line with the best practices, as this is the last payment that will be made during 22, and so the city will continue to recognize that savings. We did check again, or have checked again with bond counsel. So this is a copy of your amortization schedule, principal, interest, total debt service through 2039, and that's when your last debt would be paid off. We have inquired with bond counsel about the debt that doesn't fully amortize, that will require the payment in 2025. We will have to wait most likely until closer to the termination of that debt to refinance it, but we'll continue to check in with bond counsel periodically.
Mr. McCormick,
Yes, sir.
can I ask you a question on that?
Yes, sir.
You say we're going to pay off the last debt payment. On your chart there, what amount is that you're talking about?
So the amount outstanding is it's the Waynesboro High School debt. Here's the yearly debt service. This is the amount outstanding as of the beginning of 2021. So you'll pay this debt once during 2021. It'll pay off about $250,000, and then during 2022 you'll have another scheduled payment that we can pay for out of fund balance, and it'll keep that load from going on your operating fund.
So what's the amount we're going to pay?
$253,749.
$749. Okay.
Yeah, and you may see that figure rounded to 250 or 260, depending on the final numbers, but that's the estimate with the interest and everything there.
All right. Thank you.
Yes, sir. So the next slide we have put together is what you might call a debt calculator. So using the most recent borrowing for the high school as a base, we assumed an approximate 3% interest rate and a 20-year period. And that would result in approximately $70 million or $70,000 per million of borrowing. So if you borrow $1 million, it would cost you about $70,000 per year in debt service. So if you did $2 million, it would be $140,000. $10 million would be about $700,000 in debt service. So to put that in terms of revenue generation, your current value or net value of your penny is about $206,000 per penny. One thing to note, in the past, when we've done school borrowings, those items have been exempt from the funding formula. If you were to do a borrowing that was strictly for city projects and let the generation of that revenue go into your funding formula, you would give 42.5% of that to the schools 2 years after that. So really your generation is about $118,000 just for city projects. So for school projects, like the high school project, we exempt the amount that we raised from participating in the funding formula each year. When we calculate it for city projects, we do not. So 206 for school projects, 118,500 for 206 for school projects, 118,500 for city projects. So
I think you lost me with those numbers. Ken.
sure.
You said if we borrowed $1 million, or where did that 206,000 come from? Is that based on then the debt service for $1 million, or?
So the debt service on $1 million would be $70,000. The $206,000 is based on revenue generation. So that's the value of 1 penny for the city today. If you were to raise your tax rate or lower your tax rate 1 penny, it's about $206,000 of revenue. So if you took out $3 million in debt, it would cost about a penny if it was a school project. If it was a city project, you only get about $118,500 of that penny. So you could get squeeze maybe $2 million of debt, a little bit less in on 1 penny of revenue generation.
Okay, I'm sorry. You had moved down the line to then paying the service, and that was the piece I missed. Okay.
Thank you for the question. I'm sorry. I felt like I jumped around a little bit in that. So hopefully, thank you for the question. I hope that clarifies for everybody. Okay. So moving quickly off of debt service, just kind of onto some of the pending projects, some of the things that we touched either partially in the city manager's recommended budget or didn't touch at all during the city manager's recommended budget that it popped up through a CIP process or through discussions with council. The first 2 projects have some money set aside for them. You saw in your most recent CIP, the fire department substation, about $944,000 going towards that. The Virginia Museum of Natural History, there's some money set aside in the general fund for that. I believe it's about $500,000. The next couple of items are items that have come through the CIP, but we don't yet have funding for the project themselves or full funding for the project themselves. The SoCa complex, Sunset Park, the regional radio system, we appropriated some funds for the engineering on that. And just to give a little bit of perspective on that, that's a regional radio system with Stanton and Augusta County. The money that was appropriated or suggested to be appropriated during the budget process this year is for, I believe it's some engineering work with the, or to hire a consultant to work through some engineering work and figure out how that cost might be shared. That's not to actually fund the hard pieces of the radio. The Southern Corridor project, you currently have about $1.4 million set aside for that project in your CIP as of today. There's about another $350,000 suggested during 2022. And so in the future, you'll need about another $350,000 for a total of $2.1 million to complete that agreement with Vdot. I would anticipate that'll come back through in the 2023 CIP. Some pending projects continued. These are a little bit of your larger projects that are out on the horizon. High school second phase, I believe that was originally suggested at $20 million. I don't know that I have a new or a better number on that, but you can use the debt calculator on the slide, a couple slides back, to kind of work into how much that would cost. I think it would come out to about $1.4 million in debt service. Nature's Crossing development, that's to continue work at the industrial development or the development complex. I think the last estimate we got on that was maybe 10 to 12 million. Those are two projects that if the city would like to pursue or council would like to pursue are likely going to require to be financed with debt at some point. Some items in the operating fund, the compensation study, city manager's budget requested or recommended a 3% increase for all employees. That leaves the compensation study out there. The value on that with benefits last year, I think, was about $950,000 to $1 million. Take-home car program, fire truck reserve. We replaced the most recent piece of equipment we replaced, and I believe everybody except for perhaps Ms. Williams was on council when we did that. Was about $1.4 million for the ladder truck. This isn't a piece that's that big, but there is an engine or another apparatus that's coming up. One thing that we had discussed at a couple points was trying to put a fire truck reserve together that takes into account all the pieces of apparatus and tries to set some funds aside yearly so that those lifts aren't so big in a single year. Non-VDOT and VDOT eligible street maintenance, and then whatever happens with the jail expansion or renovation will be borne by your operating budget. A few enterprise fund projects, the ACSA, the landfill for the capital there, to do some work on the scale house, and then the majority of it is to create the new cell. We started working towards that in the city manager's proposed budget this year with the rate increase. That'll probably need some future rate increases to fund fully. TMDL and future regulations and stormwater. And then this year was actually the last year of your 5-year rate study and your 10-year CIP in your water and your sewer fund. So we're currently working on some procurement on, and we'll bring you an appropriation for another rate study for the water and the sewer fund that will also include some CIP items. One of the items that the staff has identified is a raw water tank, and then it'll also include some ongoing line maintenance, just keeping up with your current infrastructure in the water fund, and then continuing to mitigate inflow and infiltration in the sewer fund. And that is, I believe, yes, my last slide. So I will, if anybody has any questions, I would be happy to answer them now. I'll go back a slide on any of those items. Or if not, I will turn it over to Mr. Shaw.
Before you pass it to Mr. Shaw, I'd like to make an observation about the two previous slides. One of the things I heard is we've recently discussed the potential expansion at the Middle River Regional Jail was, I perceived a sense that project had perhaps snuck up on or become a surprise to some members of council, and I reflected on the habit of communication and how we communicate around budgets and opportunities that staff have to keep things known or anticipated on the radar, so to speak. A lot of these projects are projects or needs or demands that the staff become aware of and then begin to program and think about timelines, and don't communicate necessarily to a council. During a budget process, I think there's a hazard or a tendency to become hyper-focused on what is happening this year, what are the demands for this year, how do we balance this year, to the neglect of what do we expect might be a pressure point or a demand 1 year out or 2 years out. And so the collection of operating considerations and projects that Mr. McCormick has just reviewed really is just meeting a need that I communicated to staff to better inform the council about things that the staff see on the horizon that will likely be a consideration in future budgets. And then as things become more timely, more urgent, I need to do a good job of making sure that those things get on the immediate radar for council. And so this is really a communication piece so that as you make decisions for this year, you have some ability to scan the horizon, anticipate what's coming 1 and 2 and perhaps even 3 years out. Some of these you may not have a choice about. For example, projects related to environmental compliance, utility delivery. It's not likely that you would enjoy the option or the opportunity or the ability to opt out of those. Some projects, however, as a community, you could reprioritize. As a council, you could prioritize. But I think it's important to get these things that the staff anticipates at least on your radar for awareness. Thank you.
Mike, just about while you're on that slide, I just would offer that, I mean, that is one of the reasons why I think it's important that our CIP list is robust and comprehensive, and it touches all facets of the organization, even those that a simple reserve account that is set aside and we plug away at every single year, I think is important, not just for this council, but for future councils, to sort of follow the work, follow the path. It's not as if those items that were on the previous slide are going to go away. They're going to be prevalent. They're going to be a topic of conversation. Maybe the speed at which those projects need to come online fluctuate from year to year. But I think it's important that a line item is created. If it's $5,000, if it's $10 that we throw on, it's an acknowledgement and a trigger for again, not just this council, but for future councils to plan your work and work your plan annually. So that way there's no shock at a large expense that we can all look back and, I think every council tries to make the best. I know we all try to make the best decisions with the moment in this moment with information that we have. But, looking past, some folks may look at us 20 years from now and saying, why the heck didn't they save a little bit of money every year to pay for this enormous expense that's going to come online? So I think it just sort of creates some predictability moving forward. So thank you.
If Mr. Shaw is ready to give the federal spending overview or federal revenue overview.
Certainly. Mr. Mayor, members of council, good evening. I know one of the questions that naturally arises as we talk about this year's budget is, what about all of this federal money that we've either received or that we anticipate receiving, and how might we be able to utilize those funds? So I'll start with the CARES Act funding, which I think you're already familiar with. We received $3.9 million in CARES funds, federal monies, beginning in May of 2020, and we received 2 different allotments. over the course of the year. And as you may recall, they were very specific conditions that were placed upon its appropriate use, and that we had to spend the money by the end of the calendar year of 2020. I will say that if we knew in May or June when we got our first allotment what we knew by September and October, we might have made some different types of recommendations to the council, but it was a new program, and the use of the funds were clarified by the Treasury Department over time, because localities asked questions. Can we do this? Can we do this? What do you mean by whatever the language in the guidance was? So we look to what happened to the $3.9 million that the city received, you should be familiar that these were all the appropriations of the council that were either made in fiscal year 2020. Last year, I think we spent about $1.2 million, and then the expenditures that are occurring this year. So we sent $600,000 to the schools. We had a little more than $600,000 that went to small business and nonprofit grant programs. About $500,000, a little more than $500,000, went simply to personal protective equipment for city staff and for various supplies and upgrades, having plexiglass sneeze guards at different stations, and extra cleaning of police cars and so forth. We spent a fair amount of money on technology upgrades to allow more employees to telework. We spent $250,000 in assistance through the Valley Community Service Board for local homeless individuals. More than about $175,000 went to the Department of Social Services for different types of basic public assistance with either rent or utility assistance. We made a contribution to the Middle River Regional Jail for their additional expenditures in response to coronavirus. And then about $250,000 dollars were set aside to cover the city's cost in lost time and wages for either folks who there was a provision of the federal act that allowed that a certain amount of time could be taken for child care, but then more significantly, time that was lost for folks who either had coronavirus or folks who were quarantined because of an exposure or potential exposure. About $50,000 to other things like rental for, that having to house our fire company in hotels, or paying for meals, or you'll notice there's a shed that you go into as you enter the police department where they're able to check folks, take temperatures, and do a health check before they enter the department. We held elections during the pandemic, so we had $17,000 that was contributed to elections, and then additional cleaning and courtrooms and things like that. Now, significantly is the first item there, that $941,760 that is earmarked for to be substantially dedicated to public safety salaries. Towards the end of last year, the Treasury sent down a ruling that said that they would consider any first responders' time to be significantly devoted to coronavirus or pandemic response. And that's a big deal, because those are dollars that had already been budgeted and were in our budget. So we are basically being reimbursed for those expenditures. We'd like to have known that in the beginning, because it could have led to some different recommendations, at least on the part of the staff. Whether or not that $941,000 results in some sort of a windfall in our budget really depends on what happens to fund balance this year. I think the council is well aware that we have about $1.7 million of fund balance that's exposed in the operating budget this year. I believe we were clear last year when we were balancing the budget that we were in a time crunch to get a balanced budget and that we recommended some things that we said we had not ever recommended before and would only do it if the council believed that we were in a time of real crisis and that we felt like a once in a century pandemic probably met that standard. And one of those things was the exposure fund balance. So typically, we balance the budget on fund balance, but it's for the purchase of durable items. It's something that there are one-time expenditures as an appropriate use of your fund balance. But this was simply to plug your revenues. So we have to dig out of that hole first. So as we look at the current fiscal year, the year we're in now, we have to make sure that our revenues exceed expenditures in order to see whether or not this $940,000 actually falls to your fund balance as a net gain or not. If you don't dig out of your $1.7 million hole, then it isn't a net gain. It simply goes to cover that fund balance deficit. Now, I would say with some confidence that I believe we're going to do better than we anticipated last year. Certainly our revenues have been tracking ahead of what we had anticipated, that we made fairly conservative revenue projections, not knowing what might happen to us in the pandemic. I also believe that we said that if we got to December of 2020 and we saw we were going to actually lose more than $1.5 million, we would probably come to you with some adjustments. But things have been better than anticipated, but I can't tell you really at this point with much confidence how much better. A few things are, as a reminder, for instance, that we gave the employees a bonus around the holiday time, and that came out of fund balance. But at the same time, I can see where we're tracking below on labor cost in the city generally. So my point here is simply that, yes, the city received $3.9 million. The council has allocated, appropriated most of that money out to various services and benefit and relief in the community or protecting our own staff. And that whether we really have a windfall, realize a windfall from the federal money is yet to be seen. And so if for instance, we make up a $1.7 million deficit, then you'll have almost $1 million windfall that you could apply to capital going forward. And we'll know that usually, when the audit is completed around November is when you actually have a number that you can be certain of and that is available for use. So the next round of federal funding that could be of great benefit to us comes from the American Rescue Plan, and this is a $1.9 trillion economic stimulus bill that the Congress passed and was signed into act in mid-March, and that it really covers a wide variety of programs and offers stimulus in areas really ranging from child care to Medicare. And there's economic impact payments that have been sent to citizens, and there are funds that are being set up for capital projects and homeowner assistance, rental assistance, and on and on and on. Economic development, transportation, the arts, and so forth. A large amount of money, a fair amount of money, of $130 billion has been set aside for relief to local governments for fiscal recovery. And while at this point the Treasury is still crafting the guidelines for the use of the money and the distribution and how much localities will receive, we do know that the funds are to be received in 2 installments, that the first is to come 60 days from the enactment of the bill, which was March 18th, and so by mid-May, we should receive our first installment, and then the second installment would come no earlier than 12 months from the first installment. And the potential uses would be, much as the CARES Act, to respond to public health emergency. There's a provision that will allow to provide premium payment to essential workers. I think we're waiting for definition of essential workers, but it could be both municipal employees and essential workers in the community, to provide government services affected by the reduction in revenue. Many local governments have struggled much more than the city did, where there were massive layoffs of either teachers or public safety personnel and government employees generally. And so there is some effort to try to restore those services and then to make investments, future investments in various types of infrastructure. So as you can well imagine, with this much money at stake, there's a scramble currently underway to determine how best to deploy the money. And so I think some of the advice that people are sending out and that we might pass along to council is one that sooner rather than later that we would suggest that there should be an assessment of governmental operations and community needs to develop some sort of a recovery plan. That the idea would be that these monies are meant to prioritize fiscal stability at both the local government and community level. And that we do know that we will have a longer period of time to spend the money. That the current guidance indicates that the money would be available to be spent through the end of calendar year 2024. There's been some indication that the city could receive as much as about $4.8 million, but those numbers were developed for illustrative purposes for when the Congress was considering the bill. So in other words, there were numbers that distributed the funds according to a formula that's similar to the HUD formula for the entitlement community, but we've been advised that we could not depend on that number. It could go up or it could go down, but that in any case, it looks like it will certainly be a significant number. And so I think, again, certainly this may be an editorial comment, but my advice would be to be strategic about, thinking about the expenditure of those monies. I personally think that successful communities are going to be the ones who can look back at this infusion of cash and say, we didn't just spend the money, we invested the money. And I think as well, one thing that I would do is to move maybe a little more cautiously than we did with CARES, because with CARES, we ran into several times finding that we were being redundant in the use of our funds, that the state would come along after we had started distributing money for certain types of programs, and we'd find, well, the state now is doing that. And so we would go back and tell folks, hold our money if it's for rental assistance, for instance, and use the state's money first. And with this particular bill, as you look at the American Rescue Plan generally, there are a lot of programs out there. So you're going to want to survey the landscape and say, well, what are all of the, if the schools could stand to receive more money than the city does, then how badly does the school need the city's money at this point? Or there's going to be separate economic development funds out there. So again, a little editorializing here, but my advice would be that we should be thoughtful and strategic and the use of the money, and think about it as you get a one-time infusion of cash like this. How do we best take advantage of it in behalf of your organization and for the community at large? Glad to answer any questions, although as I say, at this point, we're a little light on information that's coming from the Treasury.
Jim, how do we get the information from the Treasury? I mean, that's a big chunk of change, and we're looking at, a big hit on our taxpayers here in the city as far as raising taxes. If we're looking at 90 cents versus 83 cents, if we can plug some of that money into our budget, I mean, it makes sense that we do that to help our taxpayers.
Well, I would say several things. One is that the Treasury is charged with developing the information by a known date, that they have to develop and provide the information for the funding by May mid-May, 60 days from March 18th. So there's nothing really that the city can do that prompts the Treasury to do anything other than what the Congress has already told them to do. Two, that you're really not in a position to budget the money, that you don't know what the money can be used for. So it's not as if you could say, well, we want to plug, $2 million into our budget and it will be used for these purposes, because you don't know that the Treasury's guidance is going to allow that. And that, it's as much as we struggled with the CARES funds, that until they made the determination that we could reimburse ourselves for public safety salaries, then we were looking for legitimate ways to spend the money in response to coronavirus. And so you really can't budget the money until you know what you can budget it for. And you can't budget money in advance of its receipt in the way that governmental accounting works. So even though you say, well, we know we're going to get something, we don't know how much and we don't know what they'll let us spend it for. We do know that there's guidance that goes to the state. And so far, we've not seen that this guidance applies to local government. But there is guidance going to the state that essentially says that you can't create a tax deficit and then use this money to plug that hole. And they've come back and clarified it several ways so that it's pretty clear that they don't want the states to be able to drop. Various states, of course, have income tax, more than property tax, but to drop taxes to essentially and then plug that tax relief with these funds anyway. Again, we haven't seen that guidance is going to apply to local governments, but I bring it up just to say there's not a good way to say, well, we're going to use this money and show it as a revenue line item in your budget.
Mr. Shaw.
Yes, sir.
Sorry to that. You can finish if you want to before I.
No. What I was going to say is that once we received notice of the money, and we're making some assumption that it'll work somewhat like CARES, where they actually sent us a check and it was deposited in our bank account. So it wasn't a reimbursable type grant, which is more common. So once we receive that, then we can come to the council and you could do a budget amendment. Certainly, there would be some sort of an appropriation ordinance that would have to go with any expenditure of the fund. So as soon as it's received, you can respond to it, but you're really not able to budget it in advance of its receipt. You just don't know what you're going to get or what you can use it for. Mr. Allen, I know you have a question.
My question, you said we couldn't use the money to reduce our tax rate, to lower the tax rate, correct?
The states.
Yes.
The state.
The state money. So, but if we receive the money, if we would drop back to 83 cents, we're not using that money to reduce the tax rate because equalization would be at 83 cents, correct?
Well, again, the guidance that I'm referring to is to the states and not to the localities. We've not seen that language that's been applied to localities. But for the states, they came back and clarified, and they basically said not by any interpretation, not by any means. So in other words, no act, administrative, legal act of the governing body by any interpretation could reduce the taxes and then fill it with these funds.
Right. So if we wanted to reduce the rate to 73 cents, that would be reducing it down, planning to use that money to fill the loss in the revenue. Is that what you're saying?
No, sir. What I'm saying is, A, that the guidance applies to the states. So as you read the guidance for the states, they wouldn't allow that by any means that you reduce your revenue collection.
Right.
So if it applies, we don't know that it's going to apply to us. So if it applies to us, this is a conversation Mr. McCormick and I have had back and forth, is exactly the question you're asking is, well, does that mean if you reduce the tax rate in a reassessment year, you really, you are reducing your collectible revenues, but you're only equalizing the rate versus, and is that allowed or not allowed? And in the absence of Treasury guidance, we don't know.
But when you say we're reducing our collectible assets, we're reducing them for equalization, correct? So we should be collecting the same amount of money as we would if it was at 90 cents and we hadn't had the upscale in real estate value?
That would be one argument to be made.
Well,
The other argument-
if equalization, the way I understand it is, you was up here and now, the rates go up in your real estate. So for the taxpayers to pay the same amount of money as they did last year, you equalize it down to where it's the same pay and you would still have the same revenue. So in my small mind, I'm not lowering our assets but I understand then if we want to raise taxes, we could go from 83 cents up and determine how much more money we'd like to raise.
Right, but Bruce, if I can jump in, I think the real issue is if you plan to spend the money that is then not there because you have equalized your rate with the hope of plugging these funds in, that is what the state has been told they cannot do.
Right.
And as I think Mr. Shaw is, making clear, we don't know what they're going to tell us. But we couldn't say, well, we're going to keep the budget here, reduce the rate, and hope we've got something to plug in where we're already spending money. So that the exercise really means you have to have the budget based on 83, and you can't sort of pretend that, in the state's case, again, that we didn't know that, oh yeah, well, here's some money, then we'll use that to just do what we wanted to do. So
I understand that totally, Dr. Hostetter. Thank you.
I think the other question that arises is just simply the one of, if you had received this windfall and you say, well, we're going to equalize the tax rate because we feel like we have, we can make up the money with the federal, dollars. And I'm speaking hypothetically because, again, I stress over and over, we don't have guidance from the Treasury yet. And they're unfortunately not working to our budget schedule. But the thing then you have to ask is, well, where do you get that money in the future? What do how do you make up that? If we say we want to plug, $1.4 million hole because of the equalization, I just ask, well, where do we intend to generate that revenue in the future if we think those are $1.4 million of worthwhile expenditures?
Well, and like you said, we won't know actual figures until we get our audit done, maybe in November. But based on what our monthly reports have been coming in, we seem to be looking at or better than what we had projected. Is that not true?
That is true, yes. Absolutely.
And if things would continue, then we could foresee that 90-some or $900-some thousand that we were able to use for salaries could be end up being a windfall that we might have close to $1 million windfall or go back into replenish where we pulled it out of our reserve funds.
That would absolutely be your hope, that even if you don't make up the whole 900,000, that you have a positive variance and that is money that we generally roll over for capital projects.
And if we stay on track as we have, it's looking positive, not a guarantee and not putting words in your mouth, but we're headed in the right direction.
Yes, sir. That's absolutely the case. And it's, as you look at your revenue projections in the current, the budget that Mr. Hamp's proposing, that's reflected. You can see that we're making up some ground. And, our hope would be that through the revenues that are coming back into the city locally and through this federal money, that you've got an opportunity to stabilize your operation.
Yes, sir. Well, and I go back to Mr. Short's statement earlier about, trying to bank some money for future councils and bank money for future projects. And I don't know if anybody would have the numbers tonight, but back when I joined city council in 2008, what our reserve funds were then as to compared to what they are today, I think they've been increasing slowly over the years. Is that probably a true statement?
I think it's absolutely a true statement.
And so we've been trying to, we had the money to pay for the fire truck and some other projects that normally in the past the city would not have had. So I agree, we need to continue to work towards that.
Yeah, and I would just, thanks, Chris. I think one thing I would offer too, just in terms of further redirect of the term windfall, is that a windfall is relative. Because I don't know, I saw 3 or 4 slides that Mr. McCormick threw up there of known expenditures, known expenses that we will have imminently or over the next 5 to 10 years. Many of which we've saved 0 for. So windfall is relative. So it's one of those things of how do we grow and making choices about savings that stimulates economic growth, actual tangible economic growth and interest in the community, to make it a community of choice. And so, it's the timing is not great to not know exactly how the new stimulus funds could or could not be allocated, but I guess just keeping in mind we didn't raise real estate taxes last year. Instead, we used fund balance budget to balance the budget. And so when we talk about a windfall, it's a relative term because essentially what we're doing is we're trying to course correct the fact that in the midst of an unknown pandemic and first in 100 years and having no idea what the impact to our budget was, we made some hard choices relative to our savings in order to keep the city running and as efficiently as possible. So just offer that up.
Other questions regarding federal funding? If not, then I will take the ball and run with it here a little bit. Okay. So I was thinking about comments, and sometimes I'd like to reflect on, is there a different perspective on the budget that I think will lend understanding or a different message around the budget, as we work from the introduction, or at least not the introduction, but the presentation, that I think can be beneficial. And so generally I've described this budget as stabilizing or shoring up of the financial footing of the city. There is new revenue. Obviously, the budget that I've recommended contemplates utilizing those new revenues that originate from the general reassessment. And I thought about, well, how if I place myself in the community's shoes, a citizen's shoes, an elected official's shoes, how do you reconcile sort of the beneficial or the healthy aspect of the budget that we do realize some new revenue this year, with the fact that the message relates that we're not making significant progress on stated goals, employee increasing or attending to employee compensation, or priorities related to capital investment? What's going on with the budget there in that regard? And so I've developed an illustration that I think might be helpful in reconciling some of that information and lend some perspective to how this is a shoring up budget, how it is restoring sort of financial footing, and why it is. And I realize this can be frustrating for all concerned, for staff concerned, for elected officials, and for the public. Why is it that we don't seem to be making forward progress in a general reassessment year? So if you look at the top of this slide, and the slide is entitled Influential 2022 Budget Changes, the top section, top third of that slide is a review of increases in revenue. And I would say that please bear with me. This is a very high 40,000 foot general review of large forces in the at work in the budget. It's not intended to capture every change or every nuance from the current fiscal year to the next, but rather those large forces that I think lend meaning and description to the budget. So you have an increase in general property taxes of $2.7 million, and that's largely affected by the general reassessment. $1.4 million of that $2.7 million increase is attributable to the increase in real property assessments. The next line down, you see other local taxes, an increase of $2.4 million. And that's in part correction to revenue estimates and trending that we see, correcting perhaps the reductions that were implemented in 21 are not being realized. Things were not as good as they were in 20, but things aren't, we're not realizing the worst case forecasts that had been furnished for an economy impacted by the coronavirus. So some of that is course correction. Similarly, you see the increase in state revenue of $400,000. Again, that is simply correcting or repairing an adjustment, a negative adjustment that we made to state revenue last year, largely on the guidance from VML, VACO, and the National League of Cities, that were furnishing professional guidance to localities at the advent of the coronavirus, and knowing that localities were concluding budget preparation and adoption. So that furnishes about $5.5 million in relatively net new revenue from fiscal 21 to the recommended budget for fiscal 22. And then you have to account for, as Mr. Shaw explained earlier, the $1.7 million in fund balance that we had plugged in last year. We're not recommending that this year, so those new revenues have to compensate for the loss of that revenue, if you will, and that reduces your net new revenue to $3.8 million. Still an appreciable increase to revenue. So what's going on here, Mr. City Manager? On the expenditure side, $1.4 million is consumed or attributed to, programmed for, an increase to Waynesboro Public Schools. The next line, you can see $600,000. That's to restore paving. Last year, one of the measures that we took, and we would describe this and did describe this as a one-time measure, is the city took advantage of additional reimbursement for overhead in the general fund from Vdot urban maintenance funds. That's the money that the Department of Transportation sends to the cities to help maintain qualifying roads. That's sort of an equity or a fairness measure that cities enjoy to offset the fact that, that Vdot is largely responsible for maintaining roads in counties across the Commonwealth. We normally don't do that. I mean, paving is important to us and our road infrastructure is important to us, but in order to manage through the pandemic economy that was anticipated, we didn't pave at all last year, and we took full advantage, maximum advantage of general fund reimbursement to enhance revenue in the general fund. And we would recommend that you not do that this year. This is a one-time feature repair. Go back to the schools for a second. That you may recall from Dr. Castle's presentation on Monday that the increase is 1.4, but actually $500,000 of that is a repair to the level funding measure that we applied last year. So that's your formula calls for about $880,000 or $900,000 in new recurring revenue, and $500,000 is making good on the commitment that we made last year when the schools were a willing partner to help us balance on the municipal side. The next line down, returning to the progression down the column, $500,000. Those are increases that we provided to police officers in the current fiscal year, and repairs to or restoration of a couple of positions that were held vacant last year to help manage the year on the expenditure side, and the restoration of some cuts that occurred to operating materials and supplies, not just in the police department, but in the fire department. And all of those things now are repairs that are realized in the recommended budget for 2022. You have recommended a 3% increase to wages and salaries, and that is effective for 12 months and costs in the general fund $400,000. You have a $200,000 anticipated increase in health insurance premium. That's the employer's share. You may recall that we programmed 4 furlough days for non-public safety workers in the general fund and in the enterprise funds, but the cost to the general fund to compensate or restore those furlough days is $130,000. We're seeing increases in workers' compensation and property and liability insurances, workers' comp and property liability risk management generally increases of $60,000. You have your operating budget at the Middle River Regional Jail increasing by $110,000, and then a $386,000 increase to a transfer to the CIP. If you look at, if you total those items, they come up to about $3,786,000, which is a $14,000 difference to your net new revenue in the recommended budget. And the point being, much of that correction, much of your commitment to the public schools and your commitment to regional agencies such as the Middle River Regional Jail, I don't like the term, but it's the first one that comes to mind, kind of soak up the available net new revenue in your budget. And so you end up in a position where revenues are increasing, but you're not really, you don't have anything in terms of new initiative or progress to stated goals of any appreciable amount to point to and take satisfaction in. This is really largely unwinding some of those one-time measures that we took to balance in the urgency of the pandemic with the limited information that we had available, and doing some forecasting about what we thought would happen to revenues. So that may be helpful to you. I think it was helpful to me to think about and oftentimes take a step back and look at, well, if I go through the budget on a departmental level, it's difficult to discern what's going on. But I think if you boil it down in essence to what I've described as large influential changes from 21 to 22, I personally think that it's illustrative. Perhaps I'll allow that you draw your own conclusions in that regard. If you have any questions on that illustration, I'm happy to respond to them. If there are no questions on that, I'd like to talk a little bit about a desire that members of council have expressed, some members of council have expressed to understand what a balanced budget at 83 cents might look like.
Hey, Mike,
think about, yes, sir.
Before you go there, I'm looking at this. This is a balanced budget on 90 cents, correct?
Correct.
So if we equalized, then we're looking at about $1,400,000 less than what we're seeing up there on your new revenue.
Correct.
So we're actually in the hole if we don't work towards equalization.
Well, I think you're in whole in terms of the city manager's recommended budget.
Okay. And then you're going to explain that now, though, right?
Correct. So you please regard the ensuing comments as a path forward and not a recommendation. But if to illustrate what balancing at 83 cents would look like, I would point to large levers or large choices available to the council to make decisions in that regard. And the first being, if you wanted to balance at 83 cents, I don't think you can do that without reducing or adjusting your contribution to Waynesboro Public Schools. They're realizing, again, $800,000 in new revenue according to the funding formula this year, and a restoration of $500,000 of funding that again, I don't know if I'd regard them as a willing partner, but a cooperative partner in helping the municipality budget last year, that we're making good on that funding formula in that regard. So I don't think you get to 83 and you don't include, without including some adjustment to the appropriation to the Waynesboro public school system. Secondly, I don't think you get to 83 without making, without either eliminating entirely or reducing in some form the wage and salary increase that you have programmed in. That's $400,000. And I simply think if you ponder or reflect on the levers again available to the council, and how is it that we only end up with these levers? Nearly 50% of your budget is predetermined in some regard. Either it's committed to debt service or committed to external agencies such as the jail or DSS or the juvenile detention home or regional functions for which you have an obligation under the state code, such as the Valley Community Services Board, or a mutually agreed upon funding arrangement that bears some ethical, moral commitment to honor. Your influence over that section of your budget is limited. Further, you have a legal obligation to pay your debt that you've incurred. And perhaps you have some flexibility and authority to adjust your commitment to the schools, but I think it's important to recognize that there is a funding formula there. And while I think we could rightly assert, and I would in certain circumstances, the ability to do that, there is some expectation that that funding formula guides the recommendation and appropriation in support of your public schools. So in the remaining portion of the budget in which you have some influence, about 70% of that remaining 50 to 60% is in wages and salaries. And so you simply can't make up the ground that you need to make. And as the mayor just identified, if you equalize at 83 cents, you've got to find $1.4 million in expenditure reduction to achieve that equalization. And you really, in my view, are forced into examination of your school appropriation, increases to wages, and then your transfer to capital. And some combination of those is the path to 83. And I think as one would noodle through or consider that for any adjustment of significant magnitude, such as $1.4 million or $400,000, the staff is working from a discipline of trying to match recurring expenses to recurring revenue. And that would be our first preference in terms of recommending paths to 83 or any adjustment to the budget. So if you have questions about the path to 83 or the illustration that I provided earlier, I'm disappointed. I thought people would be wowed by that. I'm not getting the reaction that I'd hoped for. I'm happy to respond to them.
Well, Mr. Ham?
Yes, sir.
I'll jump in there first.
Okay.
I'm sure that surprises you. But, in the slide that you showed us about our new revenue and then the new cost, and it comes down to very little money left over. But you had 170, or would you have in there we pulled out of reserve funds from last year to balance the budget. How much was that?
1.7. Yes, sir.
And so if we continue along to do good on our revenue and we end up that the money that we did use in the general fund to pay salaries, we have that money saved up because we're not short from what we had projected. That would start to fill the hole back up on that fund, correct?
Yes, sir.
And so then when you talk about, cutting the schools, and once again, I'm looking at the 4.5 or 4.8 money that we might be getting here. At 4.5, that's like a 25-cent tax increase for 1 year for us to generate that kind of money, correct? Mr.
And
Cameron?
I haven't done the math in my head, but I'm
Well, but
guessing you
if-
did. So
If
yes.
it's 200,000, you know, for a penny, you know, and we're gonna get 4.5 million, it's like
Yep.
25-cent tax increase.
Yep.
So, and we don't know where we're gonna be able to spend that money, but we also don't know that we won't be able to spend it like we're hoping that it's gonna be more geared to help the municipalities out. And if that's the case, we take the 700,000 or 800,000 you were talking about having to short the schools, and we could make them good out of that 4.5 or 4.8 million. And then you talk about the wage increase. Well, I'm sure there's nobody sitting here on council that's going to let the wage increase not happen in this coming budget. It's going to happen one way or the other. But if that's the case, that money could help with the wage increase and take care of that. In my mind, the way I think, when I look at the 4.5 million, which would relate to a one-time, 1 year, 25-cent tax increase, and if we don't equalize and we stay at 90, that's a 7-cent tax increase. So that would be like a 32-cent tax increase for 1 year, 1 year only. And then we're going to increase sewer, and we're going to increase trash, and we're going to increase stormwater. These are just other things that is coming towards all of our taxpayers. And when I sit here and I try to think that, how am I going to justify staying at 90 cents? And how am I going to, knowing that we're going to have $4 million come our way, and there's no guarantee how we're going to be able to spend it, but hopefully we're going to have a better shot at being prepared where we can use it. And Mr. Shaw might be able to give me, do we have a time frame when we will get the language that will determine how we can spend that money?
According to the guidance, the Treasury is supposed to release that by mid-May, 60 days from March 18th.
Okay. All right. I'm just telling you how I'm sitting here and how I'm feeling when I hear this. And if it works out where we can spend the money and we would equalize down to 83, and the things you're talking about cutting, we would put back into the budget, we're going to still have 2+ whatever million left, which is, like another 10-cent tax increase that we're going to have to be able to put back into our city above what we'll have coming in on our normal budget. And that's all I've got to say. Thank you.
Anyone else have anything?
Well, yeah, I'll just offer. I mean, the way I sort of heard Mike's explanation was that we borrowed $1.7 million from ourselves last year. We have a $1.4 million hole this year. Oh, and by the way, we've got millions of dollars of projects that we can't fund, that only get inherently more expensive over time. So yeah, I can't see, we've got a school division that, like our municipal side, has historically been unable to keep up with even market rates for their employment and their salary. And I just would remind my colleagues that, while I'm certainly, it will be appreciated, our employees getting a 3% pay raise, it's not anywhere near in line with our compensation study, our second compensation study in in a decade, that we've not been able to put into effect. So I would say that it's our costs are catching up with us. Our costs continue to catch up with us. Our obligations and responsibilities to deliver core functions of government. No one's building an amusement park in Waynesboro on the taxpayer dime. That those inherent core functions of government costs are catching up to us, and that it's important that I think that while difficult, it's a recognition of we did not raise taxes last year in the midst of a global pandemic. Instead, we thankfully had some savings to draw on. We need to put those savings back. God forbid another catastrophic event happens. But we don't want to be in a position where we operate our municipal organization off of the hopes and what ifs of what found money may do for us. I think it's interesting and important, and will certainly influence conversations in the FY23 budget come this time next year. But I think we have to operate in we know what we know and we don't know what we don't know. And I think in this instance, we have to operate with known variables. Because another prospect here is, again, we don't know what the guidance will be for the new recovery funds. And what if they're nearly identical in terms of application and confined as they were through the CARES Act? But we sunk our hopes and aspirations off of that. So I appreciated the conversation and presentation this evening. Thank you.
Yeah, the thing that of Mike's comments that sort of stuck in my head here is funding stable expenditures from stable revenues. And so, Bruce, when I followed your sort of math there, you talked about a 25-cent tax increase. And that's not what that is. You know, that is funds, but it's not stable funds. It's not something we're going to count on, 2 years from now. It sounds like we anticipate a half of it this year and a half of it the next year. But it's not something that we're going to be able to build stable programs on, because then it disappears. And so, in my mind, that really isn't the way to think of that as a tax increase. It is funding that we will have certain parameters around, and we will be able to utilize, within those parameters. But these are stable expenditures going forward. We're going to still have to fund the schools. We're going to still have to, do these other things. And we got to have stable expenditures that we know we can count on in 2 years' time. So I would say, that's the piece that stuck in my mind is we got to know where we're going to be 3 years from now, not just where we're going to be 6 months from now.
Dr. Sam Huster, I agree with you. Not including it for future years. I said this is a one-time, 1 year cycle that money would be used for. In my almost 14 years on city council, I've had this discussion every year. There's never enough money to go around or to move forward as fast as we'd like to. And about the last thing I'd say is I'm elected by the people and I represent the people, and I have to be their representative sitting here on council. And for the majority of people that I'm talking to, they're not interested in let's go gung ho, let's just get up to $1.06 tax rate. They're not interested in a 90-cent tax rate. There's some business people in this town that have told me they're struggling to keep their businesses open this year. And, we're going to put the rate and, put the burden back on them in a time that this is not the time for a tax increase. I'm grateful that we're going to be receiving this money. I hope we'll be able to use it to the best way and means that will help our general fund, will help our constituents and our businesses. When I go out here and I talk to new people that have moved into our community, they're very pleased here. They tell me they love living here in Waynesboro. They're glad they settled here. They're glad they retired here. I just, in my opinion, for what it's worth and the way I feel, and I can sleep good at night when I express myself to be honest and truthful the way that I see it and I feel it. And I appreciate everybody listening. So thank you.
So, Mr. Mayor, if there are no other questions, I'll just furnish a polite reminder of the following, that on April 26th, we have a regular council meeting We'll conduct that meeting at the auditorium of Waynesboro High School, and there will be other items on the agenda, but of chief concern relative to our conversation this weekend will be public hearings on the tax rate, public hearings on the enterprise rate increases recommended, public hearing on the overall budget in its entirety. At that meeting on the 26th, the council will be asked to introduce ordinances related to those items of consideration. For the 28th, we have a scheduled work session if needed. Then on May 10th, the expectation is that we'll adopt a budget and an underlying tax rate and confirm fees for the enterprises. And so if there is new or additional information that the council needs from the staff to firm up those opinions or prepare for the public hearing on the 26th, please let me know and we'll endeavor to provide it.
Mr. Ham, can I just ask one quick question? Going back to where we borrowed the money from ourselves, am I correct in saying that was from our reserve funds?
Correct. If you're referring to the $1.7 million,
Yes.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. So do you have the balance of our reserve funds, current balance of our reserve funds?
I don't have that information.
You do not. And so our reserve funds are basically money that is over and above what we've used that year that typically goes into reserve. So technically it's an overpayment of taxes that go into the reserves.
It's, I don't know if I would regard it as an overpayment of taxes. I would say that is the positive difference between the revenue that you raised and your expenditures. So some years you may have.
Go ahead.
Okay. Some years you may end up with a positive variance because you forecasted your revenues and they came in essentially as you forecasted, but you didn't spend as much money. And so you underspent, and that produces a positive variance. Some years you end up raising more money than you had planned, and that contributes to a positive variance. In many years, it's a function of the two. I think more often than not, I think absolutely it is true to say that we've never overspent our budget. So at some point, conservative spending has contributed significantly to your fund balance. And to some extent, we're judicious and careful about how we forecast revenues. And so they too, that has also contributed.
Okay, thank you.
Just might just follow along with it because I'm obviously interested in the subject is that our bond rating, our ability to accrue additional debt and favorable rates is predicated on what our reserves are. So it's much like a family household. At the end of the beginning of a year, you sort of budget, your anticipated revenue, your planned expenditures. At the end of the year, you don't go and say, well, I made too much money this year. No, you set it aside because inevitably you're going to have additional expenditures or capital replacements. So fire truck, right? We were able to do the fire truck last year because we consolidated a whole host of savings accounts into one known planned expenditure to achieve that rather than accruing over time, so that we don't have to do that again. Having a capital replacement plan in place where we're applying some degree, and it's paced off of whatever we're all comfortable with doing and our community is comfortable doing, but making a concerted effort year after year to place money into, again, known core functions of government, capital replacement, of our inventory, other capital projects, firehouses, and so on and so forth. But yeah, so I misspoke. I hope I got that right, Mike, Jim, Cameron. So thank you.
All right, anyone else tonight? All right, Mike, appreciate you and the staff's insight and information tonight. Very informative. Guess we'll go ahead and adjourn tonight's meeting and get ready we got one Thursday night, you said?
No, our next meeting is Monday, the 26th.
26th, okay.
Yes, sir. And that's a regular meeting.
Waynesboro High School Auditorium.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Thank
All right.
you to the
Good
council.
night, everyone.
Great.
Good night.